Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Age of Automation, Technology, and Restructuring of the Labor Market in Peel and Halton. My name is Shalini Takuna, and I'm the Executive Director for the Peel Halton Workforce Development Group. We were scheduled to release the findings from this research on March 27th at the Mississauga Convention Center, for which some of you were registered to attend. Due to the pandemic and the limitations imposed for social distancing, we had to cancel the event. We had hoped to reschedule the launch event in April-May, but due to continued restrictions imposed to contain the virus, this was not going to be possible. Recognizing that there is a lot of uncertainty around the timings for what we would call normal, we determined that it's best we share this information at the earliest so it is useful to our partners and stakeholders. The rapid advancement of technology in the workplace is a defining feature of the current shift to a knowledge-based, technology-driven economy that is well underway in Ontario communities, including Peel and Halton regions. This advancement brings with it many opportunities for economic growth and development, helping local businesses to expand and compete on a global stage. At the same time, these labor market changes are driving a fundamental shift in the workforce and the opportunities available to the workforce of today and the near future in Peel and Halton. Technological displacement is not a concern for changing economies. However, it is a growing concern in the current phase of advanced technological development, including automation, artificial intelligence, and machine learning that are fundamentally changing the workplaces across Ontario and Canada. In response to these trends and in the context of discussions on the future of work in the province, much has been written on the impacts that these shifts may have on the Canadian and Ontario economy and labor market. However, this work was largely focused on international, national, and provincial trends and impacts, and there is a dearth of research and information on the possible influence that these trends may have on local economies and communities. This is an important omission, as the impact of these changes are borne out locally in regions and municipalities across the province. Our research and project was designed to provide a response to this gap. This project focuses specifically on the impacts and effects of technological advancement, including automation. The objectives of this project were to assess the historic, current, and possible future impacts of automation and technology on key employment sectors in Peel and Halton. Secondly, to develop current understandings of the impacts of automation and technology on the workforce in Peel and Halton and the future workforce development implications, including skills development and training for the region. And thirdly, to provide labor market information and recommendations that will inform future labor market planning, program and service delivery, and training development of the workforce in Peel. Our lead researcher for this work, Ben Earl, is an accomplished community developer, nonprofit management consultant, and applied researcher who has extensive experience working in and for community organizations in Ontario. With a Bachelor of Arts in Applied Anthropology and a Master of Arts in Critical Criminology, Ben has combined academic grounding with extensive community experience to support research and community development activities at the local level. For nearly a decade, Ben worked for the Community Development Council Durham, first as Director of Research and Community Development, and then as Executive Director. In his time with CDCD, he provided leadership to key community development and research initiatives, supporting the development of key community programs such as Welcome Center, Immigrant Services Durham, House Help Durham, and the LGBTQ Community Helpline and Resource Center. Over this time, Ben established himself as a leader in community-based research and community development in Durham region. He has developed research and community planning expertise in the areas of labor market development, poverty reduction and income security, diversity and immigration, and food system planning. In addition to his research activities, Ben has established himself as a leader in the nonprofit sector with experience as a program manager, executive director, and board member for several leading organizations. Before I hand over the platform to Ben, I would like to let everyone know that today's slide deck webinar recording will be available. I would now like to hand over the platform to Ben. Welcome, Ben.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to take you through the findings of this research. And at the end, we have added a component to talk a little bit about the current context. This research was done just before the shutdowns started to occur and just before the pandemic took full force. And if we think through that pandemic, there are some considerations that we would like to make about the implications, both of the health implications and what their impacts may be, but also the long-term economic recession and what that might mean for trends that we're talking about. We don't have full data sets yet, so we can't really make any detailed analysis on impacts, but we did create an appendice to the report, and I have added some slides today to sort of talk about that context and what it might mean for the trends that we're going to talk about around automation. So I'm going to go to my full slide deck. So, okay. I'm going to share my screen with everyone now so that you can see my slides. Shalini already went through the project objectives, so I'm not going to reiterate those. There we go. I will talk a little bit about the framing of this work. This is important, simply because there's so many things going on in discussions right now around the future of work, around technology and automation and its impacts. We might have seen some uptick in those conversations in the last few weeks if you follow certain economic forecasts and discussions around labor market development. But the way this project was framed was within the context of a future of work discussions, but really it focused on technological displacement and automation. And I'll talk a little bit about the other parts of that framing just so to understand the context, but we really were focused in on that technological displacement component. We really were looking at local trends and what it meant, what these things might mean locally. This is an identified gap in the literature, as Shalini's introduction pointed out. There is a lot of discussion about future of work, about automation and its potential impacts on labor markets. Generally, those discussions are happening at higher levels. So international level, they happen at the national level, and we do have provincial work that has happened in Ontario about that, but not really what that might mean for local communities and local labor market development. And this is what this project was trying to do. Unlike some other models, we're not trying to predict the actual trends of automation. We are trying to look, what we did is we looked at probabilities, probability of automation across sectors and occupations and tasks, and sort of then had a discussion about what that might mean for the locally, what we might need to think about locally when we're looking at that, and what its impacts could possibly be locally if these trends were to come to fruition. And then and this was all around the focus on local responses and thinking. So we did a qualitative portion of the research where we talked to individuals locally, leadership locally, about their thoughts around technology in the workplace and its impacts on labor market and labor force development. So in terms of contextual pieces, there's sort of mega trends. When you look at the literature, specific literature around what is being called the fourth industrial revolution by many, especially the World Economic Forum calls it that, or just an extension of sort of the last 50 years of computerization and technological advancement, you sort of see these four sort of larger mega trends. There's a few others, but the biggest ones really revolve around these four pieces. And this is the context in which this work has been completed. Outside of the one that we focused on, which is rapid technological advancement, which includes things like automation, which is what happened largely over the last 25 to 30 years, well longer, since starting in the 70s, but really took flight in the last 25, 30 years in places like manufacturing. But we're also talking about things like artificial intelligence and machine learning and their impact on sectors beyond what you might think of as traditionally being affected by technology. Digitization and cloud computing, which is allowing broader connections, big data, and the advancements in robotics and the combination of these things, and the interactions of these sort of components in their impacts on labor market and job development. Then there's also, we also can't ignore other shifts. So we don't talk about these in detail in our work, but we had to make sure we acknowledge them. There's obviously large demographic shifts occurring, specifically in the Canadian and in Ontario and GTA context, an aging population in most areas, migration and immigration, and large trends of urbanization, which continue to this day. So these trends sort of are changing our populations and the nature of who we are. And obviously climate change and its large impacts on not only on creating conditions that are environmental conditions that are unsustainable, but also then there's subsequent impacts on the economy and economic development and planning. And then there's the last trend is around financialization. And this is the growing size and influence of financial institutions and their ability to influence economic decisions and economic directions. So these sort of these trends over the last 25 to 30 years have really taken hold and created sort of this discussion around what the future of work may look like, because combined they are fundamentally shifting what work looks like and how people work and what jobs are available and what economic development opportunities could be available and are available. You combine all of this with the large trend of globalization and the creation of global economies and global markets, and you see this fundamental change in what work and labor market development is. This project, although not considering all of this, was set in this context. And we really wanted to focus in on that first piece of technological advancement and its impact on labor markets. Okay. I won't go into this in too much detail, but this sort of gets on the point of sort of the shifts. These types of changes, technological shifts in how we work are not new. And if you look at going back through the history of industrial revolutions, you're starting with mechanized power and steam engine production in the 1700s, changing the way that originally how farming was done and creating manufacturing opportunities in cities, the massive shifts that had, especially on Europe and North America. And then you move into the later part of the 1800s and into the early 20th century with mass production, the creation of assembly lines, and sort of the de-skilling of the workforce in many ways. This was a time when the workforce went from having to be skilled to have a trade or some form of professional skill set to being able to work on things like assembly lines where their skill set was diminished to being able to do one or two tasks on a line. Created a lot of really good job opportunities, but had the overall effect of de-skilling large portions of the labor force. Which was as they moved away from sort of focused work to sort of a piece of a larger puzzle and creating those types of opportunities. Moving into the 60s through to the 1990s, we saw this shift in the rapid rise of computerization. As we saw computers, the advent of the personal computer, and then into the 90s, the internet, and sort of how these things have become ubiquitous now, and their impacts on our daily lives are I mean, the fact that we're able to, during a shutdown, still connect and communicate is a complete example of the rise of these types of technologies and our ability to use them to manage and live our daily lives and their impacts. We also, through this time, started to see the rise of automation, specifically in large swaths of the manufacturing sector. So moving away from needing large workforces towards smaller workforces and the increased use of robotics and computing in manufacturing. Not necessarily eliminating the workforce, but certainly changing the workforce in many ways at first, and changing the skill sets required to participate in the manufacturing sector. And we've seen combined with globalization, we've seen the impacts of these two trends on we all know it on our manufacturing sectors in Southern Ontario, which I'll talk a little bit about those broad trends later. We're now moved into what is sort of being called the fourth industrial revolution, and this is really defined by the ubiquitous and mobile internet, cloud computing, which provides access to large amounts of data, big data, and smaller and more powerful sensors, which have pushed the robotics and artificial intelligence technologies further, and then moving from not just artificial intelligence but machine learning, which is where software and robotics and other technologies aren't just able to make decisions; they're able to learn from the decisions and interactions that they're having, and which creates more advanced technologies that can do more tasks that were originally only the purview of human labor. So these are the trends that we're starting to see now. This is really, that bottom category is where this project is coming from, and where the work that we're going to talk about now is really situated. The one thing that we really need, one of the big things that comes up all the time in these discussions is this has happened before. These large scale shifts have happened before, and the economy adjusts. As technology displaces jobs, new jobs are created. We saw that with the first industrial revolution. As people moved out of farming and agricultural work, they had great opportunities in the new industries that were being set up within cities. And we've seen this move through, even through computerization. Entire new industries established by the technology, computer sciences, software development, all of those types of, and all the maintenance work that goes with it. The challenges that are being identified now, though, with this shift is that it's moving is moving at an exponential rather than a linear rate, the advances of technology. So there's a velocity to it that is different from previous trajectories. We're seeing these shifts happen very quickly. Technological advancement is going up rapidly year over year versus decade over decade. So we're seeing a change in how fast technology is advancing and the ways that and the things that it can take on in the labor market. A good example I like to use is from a colleague of mine who runs an education company for a software industry. He talks about his use of translation services since his company started 10 years, transcription services since his company started 10 years ago. He originally had to pay people to transcribe all of the activities he was doing, and he paid them about $25 an hour. He then was able to move that work through globalization and use of technology overseas to use people working in other countries to do it, and he started paying them for that work. It was about $10 an hour. He now uses complete artificial intelligence to do all of his transcription services, and it costs him at most a couple of dollars an hour, depending on the types of transcription he's providing. And that shift in his use of human labor to his complete use of artificial intelligence for transcription has happened in the last 10 years. And actually probably sooner when you look at the timeframes that he actually made that change. And those are the types of shifts we're seeing in many types of industries and sectors, is that we're seeing this exponential change. The breadth and depth of this change is also something that's different, is we're seeing the combination of all of these different pieces building on one another. You're seeing artificial intelligence is moving rapidly to machine learning because of its access to cloud computing. Instead of having banks of machines in a single factory learning from each other, you can now connect them to banks of machines across the world. So as one task is learned in one location and one site, they are learning from each other from multiple points and multiple data points. So there's larger amounts of data. The bottleneck in things like artificial intelligence and machine learning is usually data driven. If the technology can be created, it's the data required that is the bottleneck. And some of the probabilities we're going to talk about are based on that type of modeling. So it's about data access and the ability to integrate that into activities. That is the challenge. And then there's a systems impact. All of this is having an impact at a systems level versus an individual level. We're seeing complete shifts in economies. We're seeing complete shifts in our labor market. And I will talk a little bit about this as we get into it. Many of you are probably very aware of these types of shifts. Rise of precarious work, the gig economy, the impacts of technology day to day on work. We're seeing large scale system shifts, not just individual industry shifts. So this is the context that we're going to talk about, this idea of technological displacement. Now, so Carl Schwab is the founder of the World Economic Forum and one of the leading thinkers on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And this is what he talks about when he talks about technological displacement. First, there is this destruction effect, which disrupts traditional sectors. So, for example, the automobile as a substitute, automation substitutes capital for labor. You start to see this is where you start to see robotics enter manufacturing. It's where you start to see computing enter in other tasks. And this displaces certain sectors of the job market. Generally, what has happened, though, is it's followed by what is called a capitalization effect, in which demand for new goods and services, new industries pop up, and people are able to shift into other opportunities and new jobs. They're able to take a skill set from one industry that maybe they're displaced in and move over to another industry. So this is what technological displacement has traditionally done. And in many areas of the economy, this is still happening. But the challenge now with the trends that I just talked about is that it's not happening at the same pace that it needs to. And there are significant barriers to certain sectors and individuals moving from one industry or job that's been displaced to the ones that are becoming made available. And when I talk, I'll show some graphs later on that show that where this concern is coming from. Just at the general trend. So if we want to look at what we're talking about here, this is the employment levels in major sectors starting in the early 20th century, around 1911. And yet first, in the first section of this chart, before the line, the dotted line, the vertical line, you see this rapid rise of manufacturing. That's the going from about that's the light colored dotted line. And at the same time, you see this decline in agriculture. Agriculture was the place that most people were employed in the early 20th century across Canada. You see this rapid decline. At the same time, you're seeing a rapid increase in jobs in manufacturing. And this is a complete example of technological displacement as described in the previous slide. You sort of see this, the decimation of one industry, but the growth in another, which replaces jobs. People working in agriculture were able to shift fairly easily into manufacturing. You see this trend continue from the mid 70s to present, where you see the dotted line being the two dotted lines being manufacturing still, which stayed relatively stable for many years. But starting in the early to mid 2000s, started to see a precipitous drop as globalization took effect and as new technologies became more ubiquitous in manufacturing. So from about 2004, we've lost over 500,000, about 560,000 manufacturing jobs across Canada. Most of those, the vast majority, over 50% of those in Ontario. And this is what the decimation of the Southern Ontario manufacturing sector, specifically driven by auto manufacturing, is what we've seen as a result of that. While this has all been happening, though, you see the rise in other sectors that are part of the knowledge-based technology economy. So you've seen the rise in professional and scientific jobs. You've seen a rise in financial insurance and other jobs in the financial sectors. And you've seen the rise in things like healthcare and social assistance. So these are all jobs in things that require, like computer sciences, anything around research. You've seen the giant rise in public administration and healthcare jobs. And you've seen this growth of the financial sector. And that's part of that financialization trend that I talked about earlier. We've also, at the same time, though, seen a great rise in things like wholesale and retail trade. So these are jobs that are at the lower skill level end of the spectrum that have been rapidly growing in communities in Ontario and across Canada. Um, as jobs in places like manufacturing and agriculture have continued to decline over this time. So we've seen this to the point where agriculture is almost insignificant. Even though it's a major industry for Canada, it employs very few people because it's a very mechanized sector of the economy. We're seeing the same thing happening in manufacturing. But at the same time, you're seeing new jobs created over time. So this is sort of this trend that we've noticed. And this trend applies to any community. You can look at a similar chart for most communities in Southern Ontario in particular, and you'll see similar types of trends. So I've already talked a bit about this piece, so I'm gonna move past the quote to get into what we're going to, the analysis that we did to understand what's going on locally. So within that context that I just talked about, we wanted to understand what is the automation technological displacement effect on the community locally. And this is where there's sort of three main models that have been set up that are generally looked at to understand this. Most work on looking at automation and its impacts quote these models in some way, shape, or form. The main one being Frey and Osborne. They took these are mathematicians who took an occupation approach, to look at probabilities that occupations will be impacted by technological displacement over the next 20 years. This work is a few years old, so it's covering a 20-year period from about a few years ago. So their understanding was, and this is where the idea that what they looked at was, can a job be based on current technology or technology that's emerging? What is the probability that a task or an occupation could be automated? They use national occupation codes. They use the United States national occupation codes that they use there. They're fairly similar to the ones that are used in Canada with some slight variations, but they used the US occupation codes. And they didn't, their argument wasn't that these jobs would become automated. It was, what is the probability that they could become automated based on current tech and emerging technologies? And they created, at the end of their paper, there's about 6 or 7 pages where they list by probability, highest to lowest, occupation, about 740 occupations, and their probability of being automated, starting at the top and going down to the least likely to be automated. Work by the McKinsey Institute and the OECD sort of looked at what Frey and Osborne had done and said, it's not occupation. The argument should not just be about occupations, because what we tend to know about technological displacement now is that it's not replacing entire jobs anymore. It's replacing tasks within jobs, which still has a labor market impact. Because if you can replace 50% of the work that a group of workers do in a company, you need less people. You can specialize the individuals who you have, and you can cut a workforce down and have less jobs available for individuals because you don't have as much work and you have more focused work for people to do. So the way technology is, it's not taking jobs away, but it's taking tasks away from jobs. So the OECD, based on work from McKinsey, looked at a task-based approach and created probabilities that certain tasks within occupations could be automated. So then the Brookfield Institute, which is the Canadian example, then built off both of these approaches and did some modeling to look at what is the probability that occupations could be automated in the Canadian context, and what is the probability that certain tasks within the Canadian context could be automated. We sort of, in our work, we built off all three, but we really followed from what Brookfield had done, because they created the tools to apply this to a Canadian context. So we took these models and said, okay, we want to understand what this means locally, not just provincially, and not nationally and not internationally. What does this mean locally? Okay. So according to the Brookfield analysis, 42% of jobs in the Canadian context are at a high risk of automation over the next 20 years. What this means is that they could be automated. They have a greater than 70% chance of being automated. Again, does not necessarily mean that they will be, because there's several contextual issues that drive automation beyond just their ability to be automated. But if you look at what jobs or occupations are currently in the Canadian labor market, 42% of them could be automated based on current or emerging technologies. And if you look at what these jobs are, they tend to be in things like retail sales, transportation, warehousing, manufacturing, and financial services. Have a high likelihood of at least a partial or increase in automation over the next 10 years. And we're seeing this in our communities already. We're seeing growth in automation in things like retail sales. Obviously, that we're very much seeing that with self-checkouts. We're seeing growth in warehousing and the growth of use of robotics and other technologies in the warehousing. We're not quite seeing it in transportation yet, but there is, if certain conditions are met, you'll start seeing a shift to the use of automation in transportation. Definitely in manufacturing, as we've seen the growth there. And financial services is an interesting one, and you're seeing this specifically in things like the banking sector, where there's a growth in the use of artificial intelligence to do customer service. There's a growth in the use of automatic tellers versus bank tellers. There's growth in lots of different things, bank loans being assessed by artificial intelligence first before they're moved to individuals. So we're moving a level of the analysis process. Those types of things are being automated out. And task automation is the most likely scenario, according to Brookfield, which we tend to agree with. Which means that we're not seeing necessarily the wholesale displacement of jobs. What we're seeing is a displacement of tasks within jobs, and thus a reduced need for large numbers of workers in certain jobs. This is particularly true of things like financial services. If you remove a stage of, say, for example, the loan application process or the mortgage application process, allowing artificial intelligence to make first-level decisions, you've removed an entire group of individuals at the entry level within financial services. You still need human labor to make final decisions, to complete paperwork, to do customer interaction, but you're removing sort of a task in the process of getting mortgages approved or getting loans approved. And that's just one sort of straightforward example that we see. Okay. So when we take this analysis and we start to look at Peel and Halton, we drop it down to Ontario, Peel, Halton, we start to see that, there's not really much difference. What's true for Canada tends to be true for the local level in Peel and Halton at a high level. This is what it means, sort of at the overall level. So we're starting to see, there's not much, there's nothing insulating Peel and Halton from these trends. They are, if 42% of occupations can be automated, that is true for Peel and Halton, given the nature of work and the nature of jobs in the labor market in these two communities. So these trends are true. The national trends tend to be true for Peel and Halton. There's some slight variation between the two communities, but there's not a large variation. What you're really seeing, though, what the more significant point of this data is, you're really seeing this polarization of the labor market. You're seeing this sort of, there's certain jobs that have a very low probability of automation, and then there's another whole swath of jobs that have a very high probability of automation. There are very few jobs in sort of that gray middle area of having sort of a mid-range probability that are probably unlikely to be automated in the short term, but could be automated in the long term. What we're really seeing is jobs that probably will not be automated in the next 20 years, and jobs that will absolutely be automated in the next 20 years. We're seeing sort of that real polarization of our labor market. And this has some interesting implications when we start to look at the distribution of these trends. Before we get to that piece, though, there's a few other important trends that we need to think about that relate to this. One of the biggest things that we've seen since the mid-70s is known as this great decoupling. As technology has advanced, we've seen a growth in productivity as measured by gross domestic product. And this is essentially the wealth that's being created by our economy. And it's more complicated than that, but essentially it's the wealth being created and our ability to be productive. What's happened though is productivity has increased while wages, hourly wages of workers have decreased over this period. So that share up until the mid 70s, as productivity grew, you can see in this graph, this chart, wages of individuals and workers grew at the same time. So as we created more wealth and became more efficient, and technology created better and more sustainable jobs, people earned more money. So the wealth was being shared. From the mid 70s, trends have shifted. Productivity and technology have essentially devalued labor. They've made it so that companies can be more productive with less workforce, with a smaller workforce, by using growth in technology to create those types of efficiencies, which has had the effect of devaluing labor and essentially making it so that workers are taking less of a share of the gains that technology has for us. And this is a concern when you think about the broader implications to an economy and a society of this. This is just another way to show, this shows the labor sort of worker share of national and provincial income. So over time, since the early 80s, you've seen a gradual decline in how much in the incomes of individuals and workers in the economy. So these are accepted trends. These are not political. These are accepted trends in the economic analysis, that over the last 30 and 40 years, you've seen these declines. Labor and the workforce has essentially taken less and less gains of our collective GDP growth and wealth growth. Interestingly, though, and for us, this is what's interesting, there was some analysis done by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Now, we don't have the same analysis for the Canadian context, but the theoretical underpinnings are interesting for what we're talking about. Because what we want to know is what is the impact of things like technology on those trends that I just talked about. And what they did in their analysis at the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco is they created two modelings. They looked at what existed, and if you look at the chart, the blue line is what happened. It's the benchmark, and that is the decline in labor share of income in the United States. You see that decline that we just talked about in the United States. You see the same thing. You see that same downward decline. They've marked off sort of significant recessions as well on there, so you sort of see how those have impacted. And you've seen that major decline since the 2008-9 recession. What the green line indicates is they've done some modeling to remove the impacts of automation and technology. And what you'll note is that the decline in the labor share of income still occurred with when you don't consider technology, but it was lessened. So one of the things what they point out is that technology has been a driver, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, of a decline in worker share of income. As more and more technology has been able to be applied to productivity within companies, you've seen even a rapid decline in wages of workers. This is, again, an important factor when we want to look at what the impacts might be locally. If we see large swaths of the economy or labor force being automated, these are the types of things that are being done to the overall economy in a community as a whole. Again, we don't have the same analysis for the Canadian context, and we do have to acknowledge that there may be some other mitigating factors in Canada, given that we've got different social protections than the United States. But the trend and the idea behind the trend is one that we need to think about when we're looking at these data and numbers. So just to give a real world example of what we're talking about, there's another. It's again from the United States, but I think it helps really make real the trends that I just talked about. So if you look at the 3 top companies in Detroit, at one point they would produce revenues of 250 billion annually and had 1.2 million employees, and had a total market capitalization, a total value of about 36 billion. When we look now in 2014 in Silicon Valley, so the shift in the United States away from manufacturing to computerization and technology, they had revenues that were about the same, 247 billion, but they only had 137,000 employees, and they had a market capitalization that was multiple folds more, over $1 trillion. So these companies were worth a lot more, even though they had the same revenues. They were worth a lot more, and they were doing it with like basically a tenth of the workforce. This is the trends that we're talking about when we talk about the growth in productivity and the decimation of wages for individuals. If you only need 137,000 employees to make that amount of money, they have less bargaining power. They have less in terms of their ability to demand higher wages and access to wage growth. Technology has had a major impact on this trend, has allowed that increase in productivity, which has reduced the need for labor in certain industries and sectors. And this is the types of trends that we're seeing locally now. Okay. This is another big piece of this is the rise in precarious work. And I'll just quickly mention, if you look since 2000, in the period of 2015 to 16, 89% of jobs over that year that were created were part-time. In 1998, 12% of workers were what would be considered precariously employed, and this definition comes out of the PEPSO work done at McMaster University, their Faculty of Labor Studies. They've done this work on Southern Ontario. By 2018, this had increased by 5% of workers in the province are in what might be considered precarious work. So we've seen a rise in work that is precarious over the last 20 years. In Southern Ontario in particular, we've seen this rise. So in addition to the wage trends we've seen, we've also seen this decline in work. Okay. So what are the outcomes for Peel and Halton? And I'm going to quickly, we'll go through this, and then we're going to be we're almost done. So when we look at these probability analyses for Peel and Halton in the context of everything we've talked about, we looked at the top 25 occupations, which represents about 40% of the workforce. At least that's what we've done here. We've done a full analysis of the entire workforce in our report, but when we look at the top 25, which is where the majority of people are employed or connected to, 60% of the top 25 jobs have a high probability of automation over the next 10 to 20 years in Peel, and 60% in Halton as well. So the numbers are again fairly similar. We're seeing this. So when you look at primary jobs in these communities, in Peel and Halton, you start to see a bit of an increase in which ones are in the high probability group, away from that 40% of the overall job market. You're starting to see a larger impact on primary work in these communities. And again, you see that polarization, but it's a little bit less here because you're seeing an impact at the higher end. Jobs that have a high probability of automation, there's about 60% of them in the top 25 occupations in the community. So what jobs are these? Well, in Peel, you can sort of see there are things like shippers and receivers, accounting and related clerks. Both probability of automation is about 98%. Cashiers, administrative assistants, general office support, administrative assistants, and financial auditors and accountants are sort of the top sort of group. Retail and food, retail salespersons and food counter. You can see their probability of automation in that column there. The ones that have the lowest probability are in things like elementary teachers, education, nurses, marketing and public relations managers, so management positions, um, information analysts, things like consultants, people, jobs that require problem solving, and different types of thinking and management and a human interaction. Jobs that require emotional intelligence. Those jobs are less likely to be automated versus jobs that have many sort of routine tasks involved in them. Looking at Halton, we see a bit of a slightly different but similar groups at the top in Halton, and it's also similar and the same at the bottom, with a few differences. Okay, this is the interesting piece that goes to the polarization component. So what this is showing is the first column, the first column, the 0 to 30%. That's low jobs that have a low probability of automation. And if you look in general, the wages of those jobs are higher. So jobs with that pay higher wages over generally over the 60,000 mark. There's obviously exceptions, but generally jobs that pay over $60,000 a year are the jobs that are least likely to be automated. Then you see the jobs that are most likely to be automated, 70% plus. For the most part, they are jobs that have salaries of below $60,000 a year. So we're seeing an unequal impact of the trends of automation on the labor market. These jobs that are in the high probability that pay less money tend to be more routine, have more routine tasks involved in them, and they thus are more likely to be automated. Jobs in the higher categories that pay more require more things like emotional intelligence, more problem solving skills, more human interaction type skills, and those types of things. They pay higher wages than that. So you're seeing the impacts are on jobs that are lower skill and lower paid, more so than on jobs that are higher skill and higher paid. So we're seeing this polarization not just in overall, but we're seeing its differential impact on what jobs can be automated versus those that are not. The challenge is that those losing the work or opportunities at the lower end do not necessarily have access to the skills and training required to fulfill the jobs that are being created at the high end. And this is part of that issue that we've got. Okay, the automation of tasks. Now, so I'm just going to quickly point to, so that was looking at occupations. When we look at tasks and you look at what types of jobs are going to be impacted, in Peel, you're going to see things like labor, automobile service technicians. This one's interesting. A lot of what cars are so computerized these days that, again, that initial diagnostic work for that automotive service technicians do can be done by plugging your car into a computer. So the diagnostic work of fixing cars is being handed over to technology. The actual work of fixing the car is being done by people still, but you'll see there's that differential skill set. The entry level position where the person who's still training or is new to the sector, just doing the diagnostic work is disappearing because it can be done quicker, more rapidly, and more accurately by a computer. The actual skilled work of fixing the car is being done by the mechanic who's fully trained and has got experience. So you're seeing that differential in skill sets being impacted by technology. Similarly with accounting clerks, maybe the accountant who runs the firm is still fully employed, but the basic work of gathering numbers and doing basic analysis is being done by artificial intelligence. We see this very much in the tax sector. Most people these days can file taxes via online software that is essentially artificial intelligence and makes the base decisions for you. Unless you've got complex income or tax situations, those systems can generally do the work, at least the initial work for you. And you'll even note that most tax accountants use that, or at least their entry-level people use that as a starting point for the work that they do, and then they move into the more detailed stuff for you. So you're seeing these shifts happen. And then, cooks is an interesting one because especially in the fast food industry, there's more automation being brought into actually the food preparation, not just the ordering side of things. Okay. So lastly, I'm going to very quickly go over what is some of the local experience been, and what have people been their understanding of these trends locally. So the one thing that we did come up to is not that people aren't thoughtful and thinking about automation, because they absolutely are, and they are thinking about technology and its impacts. The challenge is that these are there's not a common understanding of these trends and impacts. People that we spoke to have these understandings very contextually, based on where they work, based on their experiences, based on the sector that they're in. So there's not this sort of broad understanding of what these impacts may be for the entire local labor market and local economy. People in retail understand what they mean for retail. People in education know what it means for the education services and sectors, but they're not necessarily making connections to what it might mean broadly for the overall economy. Again, this is not pejorative. This is just the reality. We're not yet seeing this broad community level analysis of what this might mean for everybody. Combined with this is there's not really a detailed common understanding of what these impacts might be on the workforce. Again, individual sectors tend to have an idea of what it might mean for them, what their needs are, what the requirements for them are, but they don't necessarily have this big picture of what it might mean broadly for the workforce in Peel and Halton. This work was meant to help fill this, but it was very much present when we had these conversations that this this common understanding was not present across the community. Again, there was lots of thoughtful understanding and thoughtful discussion, but not this sort of broad, detailed understanding of what it might mean broadly for the economy. So there is a perceived gap in the skills required by growing industries and the low skill displaced workers. We say perceived here because in some cases there's this idea that someone leaving a job in one sector just is not able to go to another sector, and there's not much done to address or understand if that's actually true. It is definitely true for service providers and low tech, although not necessarily low skill industries. And I would include in that low tech some of the trades. They're definitely not low skill, but they can be low tech. They have this idea that their workforces are not necessarily ready to make some of these transitions. High tech industries tend to have less of a concern here because their workforces are pulled from a more global labor pool, whether that's from other parts of the GTA or even internationally. But the sort of service providers and sort of low tech trades have this concern that they do not have the labor force, access to the labor force that they need in this environment. There is a gap between the perceived needs of industry and post-secondary education and training. And this has been expressed by both people in education, but also people in industry. And this extends beyond the sort of those initial programs that people would take right out of, say, high school, and really is taking effect at the ongoing training and upskilling needs of high-tech industries. This is particular to high-tech, and there is some learning that has to be done here because in reality, people are getting work out of college and university programs. It just may not be the work that they feel they were trained for, and additional on-the-job training is being provided. But there is this gap, especially when it comes to technology. Now, one of the concerns here is that is a bureaucratic one. Colleges and universities take time to get investments that they need to keep up with industry needs. One example we had in this was an example of a training center that was built within a college that was fantastic and high tech, but by the time it was ready to go, industry people were already moving to the next level of technology in that sector. So although it was a great starting point, it was a huge investment. It still was not keeping up with the pace of change in industry. So this gap is occurring and is perceived and real in many ways. This one has come out of several things that we've done, not just on this project, but there are not these well-developed pathways for mid-career professionals to transition, especially if they're in one of those lower skill occupations. having to now adapt to a labor market that is looking for higher skilled workers. If you're mid-career, there's not really these great pathways. Now, these pathways are not just about opportunity, like education opportunities. They're also about the financial supports required to take time away from work, the supports required if you've got family commitments, all those things that mid-career professionals have that new people in the workforce don't have, are not necessarily accounted for fully. They are accounted for individually on certain programs, but they're not accounted for broadly as people need to make these transitions. Okay. So I'm going to very quickly talk about the implications, and then we'll end on this point of COVID. One of the main, so just quickly, we know where we are today in terms of the disease trajectory. The good thing for Ontario is that as of last week, they were predicting that we're on sort of the best case scenario, which is good for the economy as well as for the health. It means that we're making progress in helping make sure people stay healthy and remain healthy. The challenge obviously still is within long-term care and other settings where people are congregating. But broadly speaking, we're making progress, which is a positive note. I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out before we talk about the doom and gloom part of it. This is absolutely one of the worst economic downturns that Canadians experienced, maybe since the Great Depression. And the shutdown of non-essential businesses and physical distancing have brought some industries to a complete standstill. And obviously we know which ones these are, right? Food service, accommodation, air transit, retail, and cultural industries. Industries that can't work from home. The good thing for Ontario overall, though, is that we've got large sectors of the economy that can work from home, especially in the centers of Ottawa, Hamilton, and Toronto. So our economy hasn't completely stopped because we do have large groups that can work from home. But there still is a prediction that our economy is going to shrink significantly but over the next 12 months as a result of the impact. This is one of the most stark charts I've ever created. If you look at that last column, this is the number of jobs lost in March. The orange line is how many jobs we lost in the last downturn in 2008. I've never actually seen a chart present data so starkly in all of the work that I've done. We lost 1 million jobs in March. Now, the good thing is a large portion of these jobs are people who are temporarily laid off, but in some of the things we just talked about around automation, some of them may not be going back to work for various reasons, either for companies are going to close, which we've already seen, or jobs are going to disappear because companies make decisions that they've been holding off on making around a capital investment. In Ontario, we lost about 400,000 of these jobs. So about 40% of the jobs lost were in Ontario. And that represents about a 5% decline in the workforce in a month. Certain groups were obviously affected more. Youth and women were affected more. They tend to be in those jobs that we talked about that are more precarious and more likely to be impacted. So they were impacted more so than other groups. Okay. I'm going to skip over that quickly and just go on to this one because this is what's important for what we're talking about. The jobs that were lost were in areas, especially like temporary work. So people in temporary opportunities were the first to lose their jobs. It decreased by about 14% compared to a decline of about 5% for those who have permanent jobs. So people who were in temporary work arrangements, more precarious work, were more likely to be affected in the first month. We don't know what the longer term trend is on this. And then if we look down to this, half of the decline employment was those who are earning less than 2/3 of the median hourly wage. So those lower income workers who are also more likely to be impacted by things like automation were the ones most affected by this current downturn. And it's low wage employees who also lost either all or a majority of their hours. So not only those who lost jobs completely, but those who lost portions of their work were the more precarious low wage workers in the economy. These are the same individuals that are more likely to be impacted by automation. Okay, and you'll see that again if you look at the industries that were affected. accommodation and food service, information culture. Educational services make some sense because teachers and others are not working now, but they'll likely return to work. But the other three here, wholesale trade, accommodation, information, those probably will not. Okay. So the last thing I'll say before we go to any questions is, why is this important around the context? There is evidence that indicates that during recessions, employment, or that is when automation and technology is advanced rapidly. So if you look, there was a study done in the US that looked at the last three major recessions. And if they look at the last three major recessions, 88% of automation that occurred during those, or in the aftermath of those recessions. When business is looking threatened, that's when they make the decisions to invest in capital to reduce their workforce and labor needs. It's also when they take the opportunity to do so. This downturn has the added effect of, there are many commentators talking about how technology can be used to reduce the impacts of another health pandemic. For example, food processing industries. They're being brought to a slowdown now because of the physical distancing. There's talk of automating those sectors so that food processing can continue even if the workforce has to stop being present, so that you can keep the food system moving better. You don't have to worry about your workforce disappearing. So there's talk of rapid automation in things like food service, transportation, other things like that, retail. You wouldn't have to worry about grocery store employees if you had more fully automated grocery stores. Those types of decisions and discussions are happening. They may not happen during the pandemic, but what you will see is an investment in these types of technologies in the aftermath and the recovery period. So there's a chance that some of those predictions and probabilities of automation will start to come to fruition as conditions become right for investment in automation. And that's one of the biggest things that we need to consider is probabilities are only probabilities. They are reliant on conditions. Recessionary conditions spur technological investment and historically have always done so and will do so again. And we can't tell this now, but it may be deeper impact than ever before, given where we are with technology and how much it can affect the labor market, and given the nature of this downturn. We could see that. Again, this is just based on sort of our analysis of existing information. We don't know what these trends are going to look like yet. We have to keep an eye on them. Okay. I will end there and open up for any questions if we have time.
Ben, thank you so much for the insights that you provided for us today. My name is Matthew. I am a research analyst with the Peel and Halton Workforce Development Group. At this time, we're just going to field some questions that we're taking from you guys and just try to answer them as best as we can. So going off of this talk on COVID and the pandemic and how it is in relation to automation, some people were asking, what do you think maybe some projections for the next 5 to 10 years would look like? And do you think that, because in the report it talked about changes are more nuanced and with more smaller tasks being automated, do you think companies now are starting to accelerate the purchase of technologies and the investments in them? And what would that look like in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, 5 to 10 years is hard to predict right now. The first thing I will say is that this is different. The COVID pandemic we're going to come back to a different economy. That's just a reality. Many of those million people out of work will not return to work or will not return to similar opportunities that they had before. Part of that will be technology. In the short term, it will probably be more around the lines of companies not surviving and companies closing. We're already seeing that. We're seeing restaurants stop reducing operations. They're not closing completely, but they're maybe closing Canadian locations and focusing on other locations. You're seeing companies close locations first, and then they may be looking to close other activities. So you're going to see some of these layoffs become permanent. That's the first thing you're going to see in this. there's a few things here, though. The fact that we're remote work is a piece of this technology picture. That's not necessarily going to have an impact on the labor market, but what companies are going to realize is that all of these resistance they've had to remote work in many ways are either being proven, but are also, they're having to find workarounds, and they're figuring it out now in a way that they weren't willing to figure out even a month ago. So what that's going to have an impact on, it may not change the labor market, but if a company realizes that, holy crap, we can keep our business flowing nicely without having to maintain an office, one of the first impacts you might see is on the real estate, especially commercial real estate and office real estate. If a company realizes they don't have to spend that $100,000 a year renting an office, that's going to have an impact right there. So you're going to see those types of things. It's not going to happen everywhere, but it will start to happen as companies realize that they can be remote because they've had to be remote. Those are the first things you're going to see. You will see industries start investing in technology. They were already going to. What this will do is spur some of that and push it along. I suspect you'll see that in things like grocery retail. They're not going to do it now because it doesn't make sense to do it now, but they've noted the challenge they've had with their workforce. So you're going to see if they can reduce their workforce needs in light of this happening again. And frankly, that might even happen between now and the next cycle of this if things like a vaccine aren't brought to market fast enough. You'll see that investment in technology to prevent them from having to worry about a workforce or keeping a smaller workforce in place. So you're going to see, those are the first things you're going to see. You will see the longer term trend over the next few years. Companies that were going to invest anyway will now invest in technology. That's where it's going to start. And then from there, it's hard to predict because we don't necessarily know how long the pandemic closure is going to happen, and we don't necessarily know how long the economic recovery is going to happen because it's going to depend on what happens globally. It's not just going to depend on what happens in Canada. So it's, I don't know if we're going to see an increase in the probabilities that we talked about in this work, but what you might see is those probabilities come to fruition in a way that you maybe weren't going to before this happened.
Yeah. And you see a lot of countries outsourcing, like manufacturing. Do you think now with trends in automation, it would make sense to develop more local solutions now that, for instance, in the US, they outsource some of their masks in a plant in BC, and there's issues politically with things like that. So do you think companies would start emerging in Canada to develop more manufacturing processes with the introduction of these technologies?
Yeah, I don't see why they wouldn't bring those home, but it's not going to create work, right? It's going to create a few jobs. It's not going to replace jobs, right? The challenge, this has always been the challenge with manufacturing, is there's this big argument among many that it's all about the fact that we've sent jobs overseas. Well, that was the case in the early to mid 90s, yes. But even then, it wasn't really, technology was always a component of it. Automation has always been a primary driver of the loss of manufacturing jobs. And to the point where if you actually read the literature and you look at what's going on in places like China, where a lot of manufacturing was moved to, they're worried about the impacts of technology on their manufacturing sector, because why wouldn't you, if you can increase productivity and reduce labor, that's always the trend. So companies that are even operating in China are doing the exact same thing that companies in North America and Europe did first. They're moving to automation. So yes, will we see more local opportunities? Probably, especially if we can get the technology and we have the space to do it, absolutely, and the investment to do it. But in terms of labor market impacts, they're going to be minimal. They'll have a broad economic impact, absolutely. It's good for the Canadian economy if we're building things locally. But the broad labor market impact is not going to be, you're not going to see swaths of new manufacturing jobs created as a result of that. You'll see certain jobs created, and they'll probably be higher skill tech-based jobs to help manage computerized, artificially intelligent manufacturing processes.
Awesome. And just, you mentioned a bit of it, but what could be some of the workforce and labor market planning policies that are developed in relation to these education trends in organizations and companies?
Mhm. Well, broadly, we need adjustments to our training, education and training. We need to stop devaluing certain things that have been devalued. And maybe I have a pet peeve around this because I'm a social scientist by training, but the social scientists and the humanities are hugely important to the types of jobs that are actually going to be available, that aren't going to be automated. Emotional intelligence, problem solving, critical thinking. Those types of things come from social sciences and humanities education. I'm not saying go and make everybody get a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Humanities, but we can't, we've devalued, as technology has grown and become more ubiquitous, we've devalued certain types of education when there actually could be some of the most important types of education we create. As people, we need people to solve problems and be emotionally intelligent and think critically. So we got to stop devaluing certain types of education. At the same time, we need to create proper training pathways. Don't devalue those types of education, but also create proper training pathways for people to learn on the job, to have experiential learning. You're not going to solve the problem of trying to create, that I brought up about trying to create technology training centers within colleges and universities, because that's always going to take too much time. What you can do, though, is create those training opportunities within industry through experiential learning. So I think the first thing we need to do is really look at how we train, work with our colleges and universities to create new ways of training people, and don't solely focus on what job they're going to get, the actual occupation they're going to get. Focus on the skill sets we're building in people, because a skills-based approach to training creates a more resilient workforce, right? So an occupation-based one creates some of the problems that we're going to see as occupations disappear and change. So we need to, if we take a skills-based approach to education and training, we'll solve a lot of the problems. And then beyond that, we need to look at having proper sort of social and economic policies in place that support people as they have less stable career paths, right? So you need certain policies in place, improved employment insurance programming, to ensure that people who are in and out of work, depending on what industry they're in, have proper financial supports, can make the right decisions they need to make around their own training, education, and career trajectory. A basic income is one component of that as well, could be a component of that. There's other things that we need to be thinking about beyond employment and labor market policies that create opportunities for people to properly manage a changing workforce and a changing labor market. And then for businesses, we do need to incentivize them hiring local workforces as much as possible without diminishing the value of that workforce. And that's a bit more complicated to do because business needs to be efficient and business needs to be able to create capital and make money and stay sustainable. At the same time, they need the access to the workforces that they need, and those might not always be available locally, or at least at a price locally that makes them sustainable. So we need to really think about how we encourage that type of thing as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ben, for the input that you provided after the presentation. At this moment in time, I'm going to pass it off to Shalini Dakuna, our Executive Director.
I hope that this webinar was useful to all of you in the line of work that you do, whether you represent a college, university, economic development, municipality, employers, or employment services. The complete report, beyond what Ben shared with us this morning, is going to be published on all our social media platforms at 10:30 this morning. This report includes a 2-page appendix compiled to reflect the impact of the current pandemic. Just a reminder, if you're not already following us on our Working in Peel Halton platform, I would strongly encourage you to do so. This is the way we share our local, reliable, and current labor market information on an ongoing basis. If you're going to be following us on LinkedIn, we have 2 accounts. You should follow the Working in Peel Halton, which has 665 followers. As an example, just in the last few weeks, we have shared a very comprehensive report on the impact of transportation challenges on the workforce. We showcased 3 best practices from across Ontario, which other jurisdictions are implementing in the hope that perhaps Peel Halton municipalities would adopt them. This report is very useful for everyone. Secondly, we also shared the in-demand skill trades report 2 weeks ago. A lot of good information on skill trades and the complexities around that. And also, thirdly, we shared once again yesterday, 2 days ago, a report on social strategy playbook for small medium enterprise. Small medium enterprise always struggle to maintain their business. A great way, especially if you have downtime right now, to understand how social media can impact you. We understand small organizations generally don't have the HR or resources to have an effective social media, but we've created a resource with the Social Media House in Toronto, which could be valuable. So just an example of what we have shared just in the last 2 weeks. So if you're not following us, strongly encourage that you follow us. The report and the recorded webinar will be shared with you electronically. Now I'll wrap it up and say have a great rest of the day and weekend. Stay safe and be healthy.